Hi everyone. I'm just going to give everybody a minute or so just to join. Looks I can see the numbers ticking up in the screen, which is good. I'm guessing everyone's grabbing some lunch before they settle down to enjoy the webinar. Okay, that's great. I think we'll get going. Welcome everybody. My name is Nicola Kane. I'm the new chair of the Transport Planning Society and really delighted to be hosting today's webinar, which has been very kindly sponsored by Believe, who are one of our Transport Planning Day sponsors this year. We're going to be talking today about planning public EV charging networks, and this is one of a number of events leading up to Transport Planning Day, which I'm guessing is all in your diaries, but is kicking off from Monday next week. We've got a number of events which I'll tell you a little bit about in a moment. If you don't know who the Transport Planning Society is, we're the only professional body which focuses entirely on transport planning in the UK. We have around 1,400 members, 65 partner organisations, and we're always looking for more people to get involved. So if you're not already an individual member, or if your organisation's not signed up to TPS, we'd love to have you as part of the society. And if you work for a public sector organisation, you can actually join for free. So we're really hoping that we can start to encourage more of our public sector colleagues to get involved in the Transport Planning Society. So do let us know if you'd like to become a partner. The Transport Planning Day campaign has been running for 8 years now, and is a great opportunity to bring people together from across the profession and from adjacent professions as well to talk about different themes. In the past, we've talked about equality, diversity, inclusion, future-proofing transport, transport for new housing, and community engagement. And this year, our theme is the integration imperative. So focusing on how can we make a reality of connecting policy, people and places. So today's webinar is very much relevant to that theme, thinking about how we transition to lower carbon forms of transport and the role of electric vehicles within wider, more integrated transport networks. So we're going to be covering a range of issues around rolling out EV charging networks, and I'll introduce our two speakers shortly. Before we get into that, just to let you know how the session's going to run, we've got two fairly short presentations, and then we're really hoping that we can have quite a good in-depth conversation around some of the challenges of rolling out EV charging networks. We're really keen for everyone who's joined the webinar today to get involved. So we'd love to be able to pose some of your questions. So do use the Q&A function. Hopefully you can all access that. And I'll be checking your questions and putting them to our two guests through the session. And we'll be wrapping up at about 1:30 or just before. The event is being recorded and it'll be available on the TPS website afterwards. So if you want to share it with colleagues or want to catch up afterwards, you will be able to access it. And we'd love you to share your thoughts on the event on social media. So do just tag in the Transport Planning Society, and if you can use hashtag Transport Planning Day, that would be absolutely fantastic. And I'll just do a very quick plug on some of our other events next week, because we've got lots happening. Our big event is in London on Monday afternoon. I'll be hosting that as well, and you can join that in person or online. It's being held at the ICE. We've got some fantastic speakers, including Ruth Cadbury MP, Vernon Everett from Greater Manchester, Transport Commissioner there, and Andrew Summers from Transport East. We'll also be announcing our Transport Planner of the Year and Young Transport Planner of the Year, and we've got some panellists from our sponsors as well. So that's a great event and a really good opportunity to do some networking as well with other transport planning colleagues. And we're running events right across the country as well. So we've got events happening in Manchester, Leeds, Cardiff, Edinburgh, in the North East and Belfast. So hopefully you'll have one that you can get along to in person, and quite a few of them are online as well. So we really hope that you'll all get involved next week. So that's my introduction. I'm really pleased to have Matt Croucher and Matthew Ling joining me today for this conversation about EVs. Matt is Chief Commercial Officer at Believe. He's responsible for growing Believe's network of EV chargers in the UK and beyond. He works with clients to tailor the best solution for them, with the full range of charging and funding solutions, whether that's near to home, on-street chargers, destination chargers and en route hubs. And Matt is a transport planner, I believe, from background.
I am.
And has worked for a number of years in the sector, since 2010, when EVs were maybe just a bit of a niche focus. They've now really become mainstream and a really core focus of transport planning activity. So we're really delighted to have Matt with us today, and thank you again to Believe for sponsoring Transport Planning Day this year. And I'm also really pleased that we're joined by Dr. Matthew Ling from Suffolk County Council, who can tell us about some of the practicalities of getting EV charging networks rolled out in a more rural area. We talk a lot about the challenges in cities. It's fantastic to have that County Council perspective. Matthew is Environmental Strategy Manager at Suffolk County Council. He works on EV infrastructure strategy and implementation, including Levi-funded projects. He's worked in the public and private sector both here and in New Zealand, so it might be interesting to hear a bit about some of your experiences from New Zealand as well. And he's managed large operational teams in delivering projects in climate change, travel planning, energy development and public protection, co-establishing the Suffolk Climate Change Partnership in 2009. And he's very well qualified. He's got a PhD amongst other qualifications, and is a chartered environmentalist, so coming more from an environmental background. So I think it'll be really interesting to hear, maybe slightly outside of the core transport planning profession, your perspective, Matthew. So Matt's going to kick us off with a short presentation, followed by Matthew, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and conversation. So do start thinking about your questions and drop them in the Q&A section. Over to you, Matt.
Brilliant, thanks, Nicola. Just start sharing the slides. Hopefully you can all see that. So yeah, firstly, thanks for having me. Delighted to get the opportunity to join this call. As you mentioned in your introduction, Nicola, I always describe myself as a transport planner. I spent 20 years working in transport planning consultancy, variously NVA consultancy as it was, became Sistra, then Parsons Brinckerhoff and WSP, before joining Believe 3.5 years ago, where I still very much apply all of the kind of transport planning thinking that I spent the early part of my career learning. So great to be here, and I've just got a few slides to talk through some of the work we do in the EV space, and I guess to begin with, why it matters. So it's probably worth starting here. Why does the switch to EV matter in the first place? Well, if you look at any of the kind of recognized core forecasts, so for example, the Committee on Climate Change carbon budgets, you can see that a very large chunk of the forecast saving in transport emissions over the next 25 years come from the electrification of transport. So the orange section there is the chunk that is removed through electrifying cars, and then you've got the kind of bluey section is electrifying vans, and then you've got the black chunk is the zero emission HGVs as well, which isn't pure all electric, but a lot of that is electric. So on the question of why EV matters, I think to me this is always a pretty kind of strong answer to that. So it is a major way that we're going to get anywhere near our ambitions to reduce emissions from the transport sector, which to date have been very hard to reduce in a significant way. And what does it take to get there then? So in order to get to that place where we can achieve those reductions in emissions and that big switch over from petrol and diesel powered vehicles to EVs requires major investment and major growth in the network, which in turn requires a major investment in new jobs across the industry. So the forecast requirement for EV charge points by 2030 is around 300,000, depending on what scenario you look at. That's the kind of government's core target. And you can see that to date, we've got about 86,000 charge points in the ground as of September this year. So the chart on the right there is the two charts here are both from the Committee on Climate Change carbon budget, where they track progress against key measures. The one on the left is showing how we're doing in terms of EV sales versus targets. And you can see it's showing slightly off track there. The black line is actual, and the purpley line is target, and the orange line is revised forecast. So you can see slightly behind, but not too bad. EV sales are growing very strongly. And in terms of the number of charge points required, on the figure on the right there, you can see it's saying we're on track at the moment, but you can equally see we've got a lot to do. So we've got to build 200,000 plus charge points in the next 5 years, which is more than doubling what we've got as of today. So that's a big investment. So charge point operators like ourselves, I believe, are committed to investing in some across all of the different charge point operators, over 6 billion by 2030 in commitments. And it's estimated by the University of Strathclyde that the transition to EVs could create anything up to 30,000 new jobs across the UK by 2030. That's in construction, planning, and the various service sectors that support the network. So lots to do and lots of opportunity for growth there. And the thing I'm always passionate to talk about, anyone who will listen to me, is the real importance of transport planning skills in order to do all of this work that we've just been looking at. So having joined this sector, from transport planning, and recognizing all of the different skill sets that are kind of drummed into us as transport planners, these all have such wide application and are so fundamental to what is required to build out this network. So anything from forecasting demand, so putting charges in the right place and modeling how that changes in the future, identifying sites and designing them, appraising the business case and getting the commercials right, core project management skills, the transport policy and strategy, working with local authorities to understand their ambitions and how we can collaborate with them to roll out a network that's going to help them achieve those goals. Future-proofing new developments, so the development planning angle. Local resident consultation is a very large part of EV charge point rollout, and as we industrialize the scale of that, it only becomes bigger. And accessibility and inclusive design is a major one as well. And data around analysis just sits behind so many of these tasks as well. So I think transport planners are very well placed to support this pivot and bring a lot of the skills that are vital. In terms of the approach we take Believe to forecasting demand, we will describe it as taking a transport planning led approach. So we look at a very detailed demand forecasting through our in-house team of transport planners, drawing on a wide range of data sets. So these include the WSP EV Ready tool, which I led the development of in my time at WSP with a good team there. We draw on things like consumer profile data from Experian. We've worked closely with Loughborough University to develop a tool to forecast demand for on-street charging in particular. And then we work with our sister company, Virgin Media O2. So we're both owned by the same company. So we've got a good relationship with them. So we work with them to use their mobile network data to enrich destination demand modeling. You can see a few little excerpts there of the kind of analysis we do that goes in our bidding and underpins our commercial analysis. A bit of a description on the right there of some of the different data points that we and tasks that we work through on a kind of day-to-day, week-to-week basis as a charge point operator. So I'm sure this will be recognizable to people in the audience as lots of kind of core transport planning competencies going into this activity. The transport planning led approach that I referenced, Believe, is led by myself. Also George, who unfortunately can't be on the call today, is due to be joining, but is not very well at the moment. So George has got a long background in demand modeling and parking. So it brings great insight to the business. And John is a GIS specialist working closely with George. And little plug, we're currently advertising for a senior transport data insights manager role. The advert is live on our website. Should anyone decide it might be of interest to them, please do feel free to reach out and get your application in via the website. That role is open at the moment, but we're looking to close that fairly soon. And then the last couple from me. We've talked a bit about the analytical approach we take to understanding where design is, where the demand is. The next part is how we design the right solution for the right location. And to me, this is a really, really important one, which is often not properly considered and understood. So depending on the nature of the demand and the use case, whether it's on street or off street, urban or rural, we're able to pick from our kind of menu of different charging options linked to the dwell time and the use case. And you can see those kind of options there from anything from a slower lamp column charger through fast charger with or without contactless payment through to rapid and ultra rapid chargers. And then the last one from me is the really important thing is then be able to back this up with delivery at scale and pace. So EV infrastructure to date has been rolling out at a certain scale, but that is really hitting a kind of inflection point now where you look at the numbers of charge points required over the next few years, and we're really industrializing this process. And so it was important to be able to back those build targets. And so we're in a good position to be able to do that through our backers, Liberty Global, who, as I mentioned earlier, own Virgin Media O2. So have a very large chain of suppliers across the country we can leverage to roll out infrastructure very quickly. They've spent 11 billion over the last 10 years rolling out fibre, digging up pavements and so on. And there's a lot of parallels to rolling out on-street charging infrastructure there. We're the best funded CPO in the UK, following our £300 million CapEx facility we raised for 4 major banks. So it's a real vote of confidence from them. And the build capacity of the Virgin Media O2 team, as I say, is key to giving confidence that we can roll this out at scale. So there's a lot to do. I mean, it's a really exciting space and looking forward to diving into some of these points a bit further. So I'll stop sharing there and hand back to Nicola.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Matt. I love the plug for transport planning skills, which are multifaceted, aren't they? Actually, it's kind of, I think people outside the profession, it might sound quite narrow, but actually, it's a huge range of different skills that we draw on as transport planners. Great. I think we'll move straight on to Matthew, if that's okay, and then we'll have time for questions. I haven't seen any drop into the chat yet, so I'm keeping a beady eye on the Q&A. So do share your questions. Over to you, Matthew.
Oh, thank you very much, Nicola. Great to hear Matt talking about the challenges from a CPO point of view. My background is really varied, and I think that conversation around what skills you need to do this sort of work is absolutely spot on, and it's really broad. My original background was engineering. I worked as a student placement at MIRA, Motor Industry Research Association, doing noise coming out of vehicles, and then I worked on to some environmental noise assessment of transport around various many places, and have spent many happy hours with a sound level meter just saying what the environmental impact of those vehicles are. And that immediately moves straight across into the air quality side of things as well, because you've got vehicles, you've got air quality challenges, and so it's multifaceted in terms of skills and levels that you need to do this. So you can't just be a specialist in one area if you want to have a good overview of how you actually do this. I also at one time managed the civil parking enforcement for Ipswich Borough Council, and again, parking and the elements of parking and how you do it, how you achieve it, and the challenges of residents is really strong there, coupled with the green travel planning side of things as well. But I wanted to just start really just by locating us, and I've got 4 slides, they're not very long, but I just want to just make sure you know where Suffolk is, because in general people find Suffolk by accident, but only if they go off the beaten track. We're on the east coast, we're just above Essex, border onto Cambridge, border onto Norfolk, and we are a mixture of rural, urban, maybe 700,000 people, and we don't have any motorways. We have a few dual carriageways. We've got the A14 going from Felixstowe, one of the biggest ports in the country, and the A12 and the A14 and the A140. but we're not hugely developed, which means the challenges for putting in place and planning EV infrastructure is different than if you're in a urban city centre basis, because it's not just about looking to see where the demand for EV purchases, but it's also making sure you're equitable in terms of access to the charge points. So Matt's talked a bit about the demand and how much we need to go to. He talked about a figure of 85,000 charge points at the moment. So that's pretty good, but when you look to see where they're distributed, you will find that rural areas like Suffolk are slightly left behind. You'll see that it's difficult to generate a commercial compulsion to put charge points in a place where they're not going to get used that much. So alongside of that, whether you're urban or rural, have you got off-street parking? The cheapest way to charge always is where you've got a driveway, where you can just drive up, plug in, and off you go. But this is a typical street. This is Ipswich, where you'll be familiar with this. How do you charge? How do you find your space? Who can charge? How do you facilitate it? And what are the restrictions? Now, the other thing about Suffolk is that it's an amazing, beautiful place. So you have a lot of people coming here as a destination, Southwold, Bury St Edmunds, Aldborough for the festival, nice beaches, and you have a lot of business as well. That's a corridor from the A14 from Felixstowe up through to Cambridge. The university, which is relatively new but is developing fast. There's a lot of travel to and from. So you've got to say, what sort of provision do we need? How do we match that up? And again, Matt's talked about the different levels of charges and speeds and all the rest of it. But our challenge principally with the LEVI funding, the local electric vehicle infrastructure funding, is to target those people with no off-street parking, no driveway, no garage. What are the choices for them, and how do you do that? So there's a number of ways that we are looking at that. In a rural area, maybe you can look at community locations. A small village has got a hub, which is a village hall, a church, sports centre. Can you put charging in there? How do you sort out the on-street charging? Do you do pavement charging? Do you do lamppost charging? Do you do build-outs? Now in Suffolk, most of our lampposts have been put at the back of our pavements, so you can't just, cut a hole in the lamppost, put a quick charger in, and off you go. You've got to look at different ways. You've then got to say, what are the different types of businesses, the different types of usages that are going to happen? So taxis, it's really important to do some analysis about how the taxis are used, where they are, because we're looking at a holistic way of targeting transport. We're looking at being sustainable and also making sure we meet all the different requirements. So you've got to look at all the different elements of that and see how they all mesh up. It's easy just to think of all we're doing is replacing a ICE vehicle with an EV vehicle. Well, in the big picture, that's not what we want to do. We want to try and make the opportunities in terms of mobility being there. So EV car clubs, how do we put EV car clubs in places which have no access to electric vehicles, maybe have no access to public transport, and see whether we can develop hubs which enable people to not only be electric, low carbon, low emission, but also have an accessibility that they wouldn't have before. And again, businesses, the cost of putting chargers in place is huge. The need for very sizable, powerful grid connections means that not everywhere can you put things where you want to put them. So sometimes you need to share. So we've been working with Power, the Charge Card, with the UK Innovate funding to say, how can we share some of our capability? There is no point every business in town putting chargers in and putting a drain on the grid, which is actually not real. How do you do that? Cross pavement solutions, you may have come across this in terms of, almost like an old drainage gully across a pavement. Is that a solution which is worth doing? I put community engagement here as well because, and I noticed it was on one of Matt's slides, the need to perhaps co-produce plans, the need to communicate what's going to happen, the need to consult, the need to understand how you implement charging solutions which delivers what you need to from an EV infrastructure point of view, but probably minimizes the disruption but maximizes the benefit. And the final thing there on accessible, one of the things in Suffolk we're really clear on is it's not sufficient to have a charger anywhere. You need to make sure you plan so that it's usable. Again, we've had conversations, I'm sure, about where buses are, where bus stops are, where taxi stops are, where parking is, whether it's lit or whether it's not lit, whether people can access a charge point. And then following on from that, the actual just usability. Yeah, there's no point having a charge point if when you plug in, you can't use it because it's not working or you feel unsafe. And that's a real challenge for the industry, is to make sure things work first time. We're used to going up to a petrol station, plugging in, take some money, we drive off. We may need to make sure it's as easy as possible for people to make it as acceptable as possible. So the challenges that we've got is linking all this up. So part of that is actually the planning, the design, the strategy, working out where these charges should be. Many years ago, when internet came in about and broadband happened, in Suffolk, logically, the places that broadband came first were the areas where it was most commercially viable. What happened, therefore, was those rural areas got left behind. We can't let that happen again with putting in place EV infrastructure. We've learned the lesson. We need to make sure it's there for everybody within a certain space of time. So we say maybe 5-10 minutes walk, you need to be able to charge your vehicle. We also have to put that in the sustainable travel, the active travel side of things as well. We need to avoid trips where we can. We need to shift the modes. We need to improve the fuels. All those things happen. And we also need to, top left picture there, look at the innovative solutions, which are really easy to do. Now, really easy to do doesn't necessarily mean you can do it. So planning and permissions and listed buildings and conservation areas and red tape always lag current deployment and innovation. So we're behind on some of those things, whereas we need to be ahead on some of those things. We need to be working with all the different stakeholders in here. So planning colleagues, transport strategy colleagues, the general public, our councillors. So we have done, I don't know, in excess of probably 40 events over last year, working with local communities saying, this is what we want to do. We want to put EV charge points into your village, into your town, into your street. Where do you think they should go? What do you think they should look like? And there's a real mix of the reception for that. And there's some quite strong views that this isn't the right thing. People don't understand that 20 years ago, 30 years ago, they didn't really want internet. It wasn't that important. And then suddenly, 10 years later, they needed it, wanted it, had to have it. Yet where was it? We don't want people to, in 5 years' time, to say, oh, we really need an EV charging solution near our front door. And for us to turn around and say, yeah, but you campaigned against it happening. We need to help people understand that. That behavioural side of things, as with all transport planning, all travel planning, is really important for this. And so we're working with councillors, working with their perceptions and misconceptions. And again, you will all have heard various things about what happened. You know, is that charger going to burst into flames? Well, has that lamppost burst into flames recently? No, not really. It's just a socket. It's just a socket and you plug something in. Where you can put the chargers is really important. And we've been working with Believe, trying to roll out, it could be up to 6,000 charge points in Suffolk, I think, Matt, isn't it? Now, if you think 85,000 over the whole country, 8% of what's currently there, we want to add into Suffolk. That's a huge level of infrastructure. That's really difficult. And the DNO, the connection to the grid, is not always as good as it should be. So some streets are really good. Some streets are rubbish because there's no energy there. There's no electricity there. One side of the street might be right, but the other mightn't be. But you go to the other side, it's got double yellow lines on, isn't it? Or it's a one-way street. Or, oh, there's too many cars, says the neighbours. Well, whose cars are they? Yeah, but a whole lot of problems there. Conservation areas, again, the need to consider what the aesthetic is, to think about what the archetypes are like in those areas. So should you have solutions which are aesthetically really pleasing, the right colour, the right size, the right place, the right flatness, perhaps, so that it doesn't impact. You know, those cross pavement charges have relatively little impact. Is that the best approach in conservation areas? How do you deal with that? So there's a whole lot of things here that we need to be thinking about, a whole lot of things we need to try and work together, and a lot of conversation, I think, with different people, a lot of red tape and a lot of working. And that's me.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Matthew. So much in there to get our teeth into. And we've got a few questions starting to come through, which I'll come to in a minute. I guess there's a question for both of you, really. So if you, in terms of where do you start? You're sort of starting, you can see this demand coming. Maybe it's not all there yet, but you can see it's on the horizon. As you said, Matthew, you don't want to be sort of chasing your tail after or potentially stifling that demand. So how do you go about starting to forecast what kind of infrastructure you need and where you might put it, and which kind of communities or groups you target in which order? I know that's a very big question, but
well, I think we come in from one direction, Nicola, and Matt probably comes in from another direction. So your logical thing, and you can see that in the way that some of the developments happen, you say, where is the current demand? So you've got to do the analysis. You've got to say, where are the EVs currently? And then you've also got to say, where are the routes of highest demand? So where are the trunk roads? Where are those that have more than 10,000 vehicles a day or whatever? And where is it commercially viable? So that's almost like your first point. And then on top of that, you say, okay, what do the predictions look like? How is that going to grow? And then the other bit is, how do we make sure this is equitable so that it's not just the main roads that have the infrastructure? How do you make sure that you have a coverage over the whole of, say, Suffolk, a rural urban area? And some areas really may never make money. So for Matt, to get him to put his hand in his pocket to pay for a charger in the backwater of, I'm not even going to pick a place just in case there's anybody else from Suffolk here, where it's going to get relatively little utilisation compared with in the centre of Bury St Edmunds, where every day someone's going to be charging there. That's a bit of a challenge. So it comes down to data, it comes down to understanding the community, understanding the trends. And Matt, you mentioned EV Ready. Did you want to talk about that?
Yeah. Just to kind of build on what you're describing, it's a proper collaboration, isn't it? So these are long-term partnerships. So, typically kind of 15, 20-year concession contracts. And so we work very closely with the local authority to understand, their strategy and vision and preferences. And there's that kind of balance between, so we'll describe it as a portfolio approach. So, a key objective of Levi was to try and leverage as much private sector funding as possible to make the available grant funding go further. And so an important part of that is to leverage scale and make sure that, you can generally deliver a decent number of those poorer performing, more rural, low demand areas, let's call them that, provided they're batched up in a portfolio with some of the more areas where there's more immediate demand, and striking that balance. So we completely recognise that a local authority is going to want an equitable distribution of charges across the area, and so we completely understand that and work with them on that. And equally, they don't want lots of charge points rolled out in areas that mean they're never going to get used. They're going to get criticism from residents for losing parking bays. So there's a balance between providing coverage everywhere, but enough charges in the areas of highest demand to make sure that you're not leaving those people short. So, and tools like EV Ready help us do that, because that looks at, as I mentioned, the profile of the individuals, all sorts of factors. So income is one, but also we actually find, contrary to kind of popular perception, EV adopters used to be kind of seen as being the kind of chief exec of a Tesla, the kind of cliche EV owner. Not the case anymore at all. And in fact, our best EV charge point users are fleet drivers, so Uber drivers, commercial van drivers, etc., because they're the ones who do the really high mileage. And so it's actually not just a case of putting charge points in the high income, well-off areas. Is much more nuanced than that. And so it's understanding the use case of individuals, the dependency on street parking is obviously a massive factor. And then strategic preference from the local authority. Some areas might be harder to do than others for whatever reason. And so, yeah, there's a whole load of stuff to throw into the mix and build a program together.
And you mentioned, Matthew, the challenge of dealing with potentially visitor demand as well.
Yeah.
How are you thinking about that and putting in infrastructure that might only be used for a few months. Yeah.
Well, that's always a challenge. I think it's using a mix of the chargers. We're seeing a good provision initially around our sort of bigger urban areas on the ultra rapid stuff, the really fast stuff, and we're seeing some of that go around. So if I give you a case of Aldeburgh, or no, Southwold perhaps is better, because I know the utilization there. We put in some 7.5 kilowatt ones, really good for some of the people who are visiting, who are using holiday homes, park overnight, just leave it to charge. What we also have there is a huge number of people that come, and their dwell time is maybe 3 or 4 hours. They come along, they walk along, get some chips, have an ice cream, walk along the pier, and then go home. So having that mid-range charger, that sort of 40 to 50 DC in that situation is quite good. It's technically it's easier to put in than the ultra rapid, but one of the lessons we've learned there is one of the suppliers there has just shifted one of the fast chargers, 7 kilowatt, up to the sort of the lower end of the DC, and they've had complaints from the locals because they say, well, we can't leave our car overnight there. We've got to go within a time scale which isn't suitable. So to have chargers which fit the dwell time is really important. So in those places which are a lot of holiday residential stuff, then overnight chargers work really well. Where people are just spending 2 or 3 hours, it might be something a bit faster is appropriate. Now, again, the usage, I remember, I think it was ZapMap was talking about the utilization. You can have a fast charger and a rapid charger, and if you put them in somewhere, you find often that it might have 3 hours use a day, but the amount of power delivered out of the rapid one is far greater, so the profit is greater. So how do you balance that utilization with the commercials as well? And where do people want them? How can people use them? Should they be car parks? Should they be on street? Again, the challenge is if you put a on-street charger outside someone's home, are they going to assume they have the right to use that? How do you enforce from a transport side of things when someone ICEs a EV charging point up? Do you put a TPO on it? Do you make sure you have to have enforcement, or do you say, well, no, we're going to get to the point where people will work together, or whether you'll get enough charges so people haven't got to lose their rag with their neighbor because they parked next to the charger. So yeah, it's a dwell time, I think, is one of the most important thing in terms of knowing where and how long they're going to stay for, to understand what provision they need.
That does require really quite deep understanding of how people are travelling in that area, what sorts of things they might be doing when they're there, and presumably that will change over time as well as vehicle battery technology.
Well, of course it will. But we're a long way from when I used to drive a Toyota Prius and could trundle along really quietly for a couple of miles to my cousin current Kia, where I can do 280 miles and not even have to think about a public charger. And the other bit that from us as a local authority working with Believe, Matt's team can say, this is what we think, and we say, oh, you've missed something there, because we know Suffolk so well, and the only people that really shout out for the Suffolk residents is the local authority, because we know the people, we know the nature of it, and so therefore we can try and match our subjective stuff and our quantitative stuff along with Matt's quantitative stuff and his commercials.
Yeah, the local knowledge is invaluable, and what your plans are, more broadly in terms of future development. Maybe there are plans to pedestrianise some roads or introduce cycle routes and so on. So there's all sorts of other layers of consideration that go into this. This is, as you say, Nicola, it requires a proper understanding of the behaviours of individuals, not only now, but we're investing for 15 years here, so we need to kind of try and anticipate, well, how are commuting patterns going to change? What are people's retail behaviours likely to look like in 5 years, 10 years? When do autonomous vehicles come into play? Where do car clubs feature? And so all sorts of things driving behaviours, which in turn influence where they're going to want to charge. And we ultimately think that it comes down to convenience. I think EV charging has to be as frictionless as possible. People just want it to happen where they're going anyway. I don't think they want to go out of the way to have to go off the beaten track and change their plans. If they're parking outside on their street overnight, they just want to wake up in their car to be charged the next day. They don't want to have to drive off and hunt around and find something. So the real imperative there for us to work together with the local authority and to understand current and future demand.
Yeah. And there's a bit about behavioural stuff as well. I think I look back at my 2 teenage boys, and when they were teenagers, they would graze all the time of food. There was no dinner time or lunchtime or breakfast. It was like wherever there was food, they would graze. And with cars sometimes, and electric vehicles, I sometimes think you just have to say, well, I've just parked up at the co-op. I'll just plug it in for half an hour. I've just gone to Sainsbury's, I'll plug it. Oh, it's outside the house. I'll just plug it in for a couple of hours. And you take the opportunity wherever you can. And clearly some of the ultra rapid stuff charging that people like BYD are bringing in might change that, 5 minutes and you're full on. But yeah, I noticed there's a question about accessibility and wheelchair accessible. So this is a challenge because it costs more to put things in which need more space. So PAS 1899 is probably the best standard for accessibility. We've said to believe wherever possible, we want to comply with 1899 so that it's accessible by people who may have mobility issues. There's a huge number of people who are Motability customers because of the way Motability is shifting the fleet across to EVs. So it's really, really important. And the other thing that we've said to believe is we'd like contactless on fast chargers. Now, that's not something that any commercial company is jumping up and down about, really, because it costs more to do. But we want it to be as easy as possible for people to charge. Whether you can use an app, yes, there will be some time plug and charge, but just tapping a card is often the easiest thing that our residents say they want, but it costs more, which means the cost to Matt, the commercials look different. But we've said we want to make it as easy as possible and make those accessible. There's some areas we won't be able to do that. Sometimes you can't do it. But yeah, putting charge points in a tight space where you can't access it, where it's not lit, where it's hidden in the backwaters of a car park behind a supermarket you don't want to go to, that's not the way to do, and it doesn't work for either of us.
100%. We completely agree. So we believe strongly in making the bay designs to the highest standards of accessibility. The challenge, as you touched on, is often not so much a lack of willing on our part or the local authority's part. It's just space. So particularly on the street, on the street, the pavement widths are generally not what you would hope to start with. And so we're working on some innovative pilot projects in East London to do build outs with drop curbs to kind of really maximize accessibility for all types of chargers. But that requires the local authority, it has a space impact and generally a loss of parking bays, and that can be really tricky. I probably don't need to tell anyone on the call that. So but the most contentious thing you can do is lose parking bays from a street. So we're game, but
we're not.
The
amount of public and councillor involvement about having chargers outside their houses, as you know, Matt, is huge. But I think also the changes in technology in some ways, and Matt can tell me if I'm wrong, part of the attraction to charge point operators is they're entering into a concession agreement with us as a council. It gives them the opportunity to put in charging infrastructure now. In 5 years' time, it might be different. It might be that they've basically got the space to put in, say, inductive charging, so that there's not an issue with accessibility. You can just drive over, you're away. That's fine. I saw also there's a question. So there's a question about hybrid and plug-in petrol. I'm going to be controversial here, in as much as I think hybrid vehicles are the best of both worlds and the worst of both worlds. So to be honest, you've got all the technology of a combustion engine, all the complexity of it, all the complexity of the electric vehicle, and you're putting them together. So why would you do that when you could have an electric vehicle which probably you can manage the range, you can probably manage the charging, and it will actually cost you less in terms of maintenance, and whole life costing after the first couple of years from a carbon point of view is probably better. So I know, Keith, it's a genuine question, but I don't really worry about hybrid vehicles. I just say, yeah, shrug my shoulders. I'm not interested in them particularly. I'm either interested in my 60-year-old Morris Minor or my Kia EV and how I deal with both of those two sides. The middle bit, I think it's a transitional technology at the moment, is what I would say. I know not everyone will agree with that, and Keith, you might want to come back.
I would agree. They're a bridging technology, aren't they? And I get for some people there's a little bit of comfort there in knowing that you've got the combustion engine there to it. But yeah, I don't think we'll see them stick around very long, because they are ultimately quite inefficient. You've got two whole powertrains there, a whole load of complexity and cost. And once people, I think, get more comfortable with the infrastructure and confident around range, I think that will look a bit of a dated solution quite quickly. But to answer the question, yes, you can charge them on those public
So I
chargers.
didn't answer the question. I changed it, didn't I?
You answered a different version of the question.
Yeah. More of interest to me is actually Elaine's question, which is talking about where you've got commercial drivers and they need to charge for business. How do you make sure they can charge? So how can you make sure there's chargers availability? What do you need to have? Chargers which are bookable so that they can be guaranteed of getting the charge. I remember talking to Volvo and their HGVs and talking to them about how they manage in terms of their vehicles, and they do some really useful telematics. So they'll look at a company and say, okay, where do you take your trucks? Where do you take your vans? Let's see your typical routes. What are the ranges you need for that? Can we do it? Can't we do it? And I think there's an element of, it's easy to presume that for some commercial applications, it's not going to work, but it might. What you need to do is you need to look at the data. You need to look to see where there's a predictability. So the A14 corridor, all those pallet lorries going maybe 100 miles up and down, could they be electric? Well, quite possible, because you know where they start, you know where they finish, and they're not going to go anywhere else. Could a Tesco's van be electric going around a really rural area? Depends on how far it's got to go. So charging speed, base, bookability, all those things are really important, I think, Elaine.
Just to add to that, I would say so. If the question is, are they able to use on street, and the issues of size, it's quite an interesting one. Actually, I think they'll end up using a whole mix of different ecosystems. Quite a high proportion of vans are taken home at the end of the working day and are going to places where people don't have off-street parking. So there is definitely a segment of van demand that will need charging, and if you could do that from home, they would. Bay size is an issue, because it kind of links to your second question about the hardest PAS requirements to meet. The hardest ones to me are always space related, because you just can't, if the only option is to put a charger in X location, if it doesn't have space, it doesn't have space. So it's just very hard to do anything about that. But you can have large enough on-street parking bays that you can have vans charged there. Equally, some will charge, a lot will charge at the depot if they're taken back, because you can do that very cost effectively. And then others, as Matthew's talking about, will just charge on the go, high powered charging. They don't really like doing that because it's eating into their working day, and time is money. But I think for some that will be the only options. I think we'll see a few different options there.
I think every Greg should have a charging bay next to it, to be honest, Matt, because then I think that sort of means you grab your breakfast and off you go. The other challenge, I think, is those things with trailers that drive through charging locations. And local to us here in Ipswich, we had a big EV experience day back in June, July, and a couple of the big trucks said, where could I park? Where could I charge? And I was able to go, and I've got local knowledge, well, up there on the Worsted Road, up there at the Fastned place. But very few places can you drive through with big stuff and charge, and if you've got a trailer. So those bits are quite difficult when it's on street. You may have seen pictures of people with caravans pulled by something like a Kia EV9 who have to uncouple the caravan, then charge the car, and then recouple. Clearly, that's not a very practical solution long term, I don't think.
Interesting you mentioned Greg's. We took an electric car to France over the summer and discovered the best place to charge was McDonald's.
Well, in the UK, in the UK, McDonald's and the Instavolt, two things. One is you can get a cheap cup of coffee, and secondly, the Instavolt stuff is there and it works. The cost of it is another matter, but when I charge up or when I fill up petrol at a motorway service station, I know I'm going to be paying more than I will at home. I'm not, I'm not looking for a cordon bleu meal when I cook at home. So charging is cheap. I've already paid for the infrastructure. I've already got the electricity. It's a marginal cost. When you go on the street, there's a whole lot of stuff there. It's not cheap to put that kit in place. It doesn't last huge amounts of years. The back office, making sure you meet all the government KPIs and regulations to make sure it's okay, make sure it's safe enough to be used, and all those sort of things is interesting.
We've got a question from Ben in the chat, which you might not about recent announcements about making it easier to install cross-pavement solutions, and your views on how that fits with an EV infrastructure strategy and public chargers, and is there a conflict there with Levi rollout plans and targets? And who decides who gets that access?
Yeah, there's a mix of solution, isn't there? And the fact that Matt put up a picture of, what was it, 7 different charging speeds and capabilities. You don't need all of those in the same place. When I first lived in Sheffield, I could park outside my street, but I couldn't guarantee it. If I had to park down the road, well, is that fair, not fair? If I can charge outside my house, is that fair or not fair? Well, there's a lot of things which aren't. We've got to do the best with the infrastructure we've got, and not everything is possible. So that fairness bit, well, sorry, but it's just life. Doesn't always mean you can. Is it in conflict with the big CPOs? I don't know, Matt. We've talked about with your team, where can't you put a charger in place because the connection costs are too high? That's a possibility. So, we say, well, okay, you can't put it in there. Maybe we can offer a channel. The planning side of things needs to be sorted out for the cross-pavement channel. The highways things need, approval. There's so much red tape working with highways colleagues. It's a nightmare. We're doing it, and we're doing it well, but it's difficult. How much of a threat is it, Matt?
I mean, you can probably anticipate I'm not the biggest fan. I guess, a few different points, really. I think they need to be coordinated quite carefully, so as to not overlap with where people are, making long-term infrastructure investments here. But not just from that side. They're quite a compromised solution in quite a lot of respects, and it just depends what the objectives are, really. So, the primary risk, as I've always seen it, again with my transport planning hat on, is that you're kind of inadvertently privatizing the bay outside somebody's house, because you're building in an expectation from them that they're going to be able to park there, access that cable gully, and plug in and charge. And that's not a good idea for all the reasons everyone on this call will know. That's the public highway. Nobody has a right to expect to park outside their house. It's quite compromised on a safety ground, in that on public charging infrastructure, we quite rightly are held to very, very high standards around where we deploy, the touch risk of proximity to other metal or electrified street furniture, security around the chargers. So I think there's quite a lot there that I would be a bit concerned about. And ultimately, I think charging infrastructure, if done well, should be a good community resource. It's a far more efficient way to roll out infrastructure, rather than duplicate it in every house. You only really need to charge. I charge probably once every 5-6 days. That's probably pretty average. So put 2 to 4 charging bays on a street, and that will serve a large number of houses quite efficiently. And in time, the not too distant future, there'll be all sorts of clever grid balancing and V2G that you can do to pass on cost savings and manage that very efficiently through a more centralized network, rather than trying to ram everything through very constrained local kind of domestic connections over a slightly botched kind of gully. It doesn't seem a very good solution to me. So anyway, I've said it's got a part to play. I just don't think it's a very big part. I think it's filling in gaps that you can't do a more rounded solution for. Is that fair? What do you think?
Well, I think, I think the idea botched. My first experience of it was in a Victorian drainage channel in Woodbridge near Ipswich, where someone had just put their Tesla charging cable along the drainage channel. I thought that's a really neat solution. Why wouldn't you do that? I think the interesting thing will be whether that gives pressure on the curbside CPOs in terms of prices, because 7p off-peak charging, and I know it's, as I say, it's a marginal cost compared with maybe 40p, 45 from a CPO like yourself. I think that automatically pushes people into saying, can I do this cheaper? Not necessarily saying that's right, but I think people are very conscious of that. And I know it's not a balanced equation. It's no way is it a balanced equation.
And what's often overlooked in that scenario is the cost of the hardware. So buying
Absolutely.
a charger for your house, I've gone through 3, by the way. I don't know about anyone else, but the domestic chargers don't last very well, and they're not cheap. And so by the time you layer that on to the tariff costs, so the equation is, as you say, is a little bit kind of hard to make that direct comparison. But
no, I think that's right, and I think you can see that with people looking at mobility as a service. So more people now lease their vehicles than they do buy often, because actually I can spend £300 a month leasing my MG ZS, and I don't have to worry about it. I got a flat tire the other week. Tusker just sorted out for me. It was brilliant.
Yeah.
It's just like worry free. So why would I want to have to worry about the cost of the infrastructure? And then when that gets mixed up with a vehicle to grid system, and you're ending up with a whole home vehicle mobility ecosystem where someone else is managing it all, perhaps I could hand the whole thing, heating, electricity, vehicle, all over to Octopus or whoever, and say, I'll pay you £200 a month. You sort it all out, and I'm really not going to worry about it, because I don't want to pay 1,500 quid for a charger, another 1,500 quid for a gully, another however many £1,000 for a car, X amounts for a heat pump. You sort it out. Just tell me how much a month. I can budget for that. I know where I am. It's easy. So maybe we're going to see different stuff.
I think so. I think it will evolve quite interesting ways over the next few years, particularly as heat pumps come online, and there's a whole lot of clever management to be done with all of that.
Yeah.
We're almost out of time. I can't believe the hours that flown by. I wanted to just finish off with what is quite a big question, but just like your initial thoughts on this before we wrap up. We're talking about integrated transport here, and there is obviously a risk that we invest heavily in infrastructure that effectively is encouraging more cars, although they're cleaner cars, into our towns and cities and streets. How do we balance investment in EV infrastructure with other sustainable transport modes, and make sure we're not undermining the sort of long-term viability of public transport, active travel? Any kind of initial thoughts on that, just to wrap up the session?
I can come from this from one direction. If I was doing a sort of sustainable transport plan, I would say you've got to have some price carrots in there. So it's still cheaper to go by bus, still better to go by train. Autonomous vehicles, EV car clubs. You need to get people out of single occupancy use of cars, because that frees up space. It makes quicker journey time, if you get it right, really difficult in a rural area. It's lovely, tomorrow, Matt, when I come to see you at the office, I'll jump on the train, I'll maybe jump on the tube, I'll maybe walk for 5 minutes. It's easy. If I said to you, come and visit us in Southwold, you might set off today to meet me on Monday, if you had to use public transport. So there is a real blend of stuff here, but reducing single occupancy car, pricing cars out where it's appropriate is not a popular thing, but that is clearly having an impact in some areas.
No, I agree. So still, I've got the travel hierarchy pyramid in my mind as we're talking, and I still believe that. So I guess that the chart I showed in my first slide is a reminder that electrification is the way to reduce a large amount of emissions. But I still believe in the core principles of where we can prioritize and make preferable walking, cycling, public transport. We definitely
avoiding
should.
and shifting is those two sort of things before you start just sort of improving, isn't it? It's so important.
Perfect. We will end on that positive note. Thank you so much, Matt and Matthew, for coming and joining our webinar today. It's been a brilliant conversation, absolutely flown by. Thank you to everyone who's joined online today. This will be on a TPS website and YouTube after the event, so do share with other colleagues, and we'd love to see you at some of our other Transport Planning Day events. I'll drop a link in the chat so you can book onto those and see what else is coming up. And fantastic. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks,